A heavy oak door slammed shut behind a man in a black coat. The orchestra stopped mid-note. A glass slipped from a waiter's tray and shattered on marble. 300 guests froze in their chairs. Nobody dared to chew. Nobody dared to swallow. A single chandelier hummed above a wedding cake that no one had yet cut. The man at the door did not take off his coat. He walked past the bride. He walked past the groom. He walked straight to the microphone the singer had just been holding. He tapped it once. The tap echoed like a gunshot. He looked at the room with eyes that had buried more men than most people meet in a lifetime. Then he asked one simple question that turned a wedding into a courtroom. Who in this room thinks he can survive what comes next? Stay with me on this one. The hall had been built for celebration. Crystal glasses caught the light. Long tables stretched from the back wall to the dance floor. White roses crowded the centerpieces. The smell of fresh bread mixed with cigar smoke from the older men who never bothered to step outside. For most of the evening, the room had been loud. Loud in the good way. Toasts, laughter, children running between chairs, old aunts pulling young cousins into hugs they could not escape. The waiters moved in pairs. They had been told to keep wine glasses full, but never to interrupt a conversation. They had been told to stay out of the back hallway entirely. They had been told not to speak to the men in dark suits who stood near each exit. The waiters were professionals. They had worked weddings like this one before. They knew how to be invisible. The bride wore ivory. Her name was Katarina. Everyone called her Kat. She had her mother's eyes and her father's silence. When she walked into the reception 2 hours earlier, the room stood for her without being asked. Her father had not been there for that moment. He had sent word that he was caught in business. His business was something nobody asked about in detail. Not in this family. Not at this kind of wedding. Kat had grown up inside this kind of silence. She had learned early which doors to knock on and which doors to walk past. She had learned how to read a man's face before he opened his mouth. She had learned that a quiet phone call in the kitchen at midnight usually meant somebody she had known her whole life was about to disappear. She did not ask questions. She had been told once, when she was 11, that questions were the only things in this house that did not have an answer. She remembered that line the way other children remember nursery rhymes. The groom was a young man named Tommaso. Tall, polite, quiet around the older men. He came from a respectable side of the same world the bride's father lived in. The marriage had been blessed by two old families that had not always been friends. That alone made it news. People had traveled in from 3 countries to be there. Bodyguards stood at every door without pretending to be anything else. Even the photographer had been chosen by a man with a long memory. Tommaso had grown up watching his father bow to certain men and ignore others. He had learned the rules of the room before he had learned to drive. He had loved Kat for almost 6 years, and he had asked her father's permission in person, alone, in a study that smelled like leather and old smoke. The Don had not answered him for almost a full minute. The Don had looked at him the way men look at a horse they are about to buy. Then the Don had stood, walked around the desk, and put one hand on the boy's shoulder. The Don had said one sentence: "Be good to her or I will know." Tommaso had not slept for 2 nights after that. He had been a careful man ever since. For 2 hours the wedding behaved itself. The bride danced with her uncles. The groom danced with his mother. Old enemies smiled at each other across a glass of red wine. The orchestra slid from waltz to swing and back again. The bride disappeared once to fix her dress. Her cousin Marie went with her down a back hallway near the kitchen. They were gone for maybe 7 minutes. When they came back, Kat had a small mark on her wrist that her sleeve almost hid. Almost. She smiled like nothing had happened. She kissed her new husband on the cheek. She kept dancing. Her cousin Marie did not dance after that. Marie stood near the wall and watched the door. Marie was older. Marie had grown up in this family. Marie knew what she had seen in that hallway. She wanted to find someone to tell. The only person she would have told was Kat's father. And Kat's father was not yet in the building. Marie tried the kitchen first. The cook waved her off because the cook did not get involved. Marie tried one of the men in dark suits at the side door. The man in the dark suit listened to 2 sentences. Then he turned his back and spoke quietly into a small radio clipped to his collar. He did not look at Marie again. He did not have to. The message was already on its way out of the building and into the back seat of a black car somewhere on a wet road. That was the message that made the Don put his coat on an hour early. Outside, a black car pulled up to the side entrance. 2 men got out first. They opened the back door. A third man stepped out. He did not rush. He did not check his watch. He buttoned his coat in the cold night air. He looked at the front of the building once, the way a man looks at a place he already owns. Then he walked inside. The 2 men with him did not follow him into the hall. They closed the door behind him and stayed in the corridor. That was the moment the orchestra stopped. That was the moment everyone in the room understood that the wedding was over and something else had begun. The Don had arrived, and the Don was already looking for someone. The conductor of the orchestra had been told nothing. He simply saw the man walk in, and he lowered his baton without finishing the bar. The violinist nearest the door let her bow drift down. The singer stepped back from her microphone and went to stand against the wall. None of them had been given a signal. They did not need one. They were not the first wedding musicians in this country to recognize that kind of arrival. The Don tapped the microphone a second time. The sound carried into every corner of the hall. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. He spoke the way old priests speak in old churches. Slow, even, final. He said good evening. He said he was sorry he was late. He said his daughter looked beautiful. He thanked the families for coming. He nodded to the groom's father across the room. The groom's father nodded back, but his nod was stiff, like a man who had just realized he was sitting on a chair made of glass. Then the Don put his hand on the side of the microphone stand. He looked at the floor for a long moment. When he lifted his eyes, the room was already different. People who had been smiling were not smiling anymore. People who had been holding wine glasses set them down without being told. Even the children stopped moving. A mother near the front pulled her small son onto her lap and put her hand over his mouth without thinking. A young waiter at the back set his tray down on an empty chair and stepped behind a column. 2 old men at the head table, both retired, both still wearing rings that meant something, glanced at each other and then quietly slid their wine glasses to the far edge of the table, as if a glass within reach could be the wrong thing to be holding in the next 60 seconds. He spoke again. He said that during the ceremony in a back hallway, somebody had put his hands on his daughter. He said somebody had whispered a threat into her ear. He said his daughter had not told him directly. He had learned it from somebody who had loved her since she was a baby. He said he had walked into this hall for 2 reasons. The first reason was to dance with his daughter on the most important night of her life. The second reason was to give one man, one single man, the chance to stand up on his own. Then he said the line that froze the room solid. Whoever touched the bride stands up now. Nobody breathed. Nobody blinked. The bride's mother put her hand over her mouth. The groom's father turned a shade lighter than the tablecloth. The bride herself did not move. She stared at her father like a child waiting to be told whether the storm outside was over or just starting. For a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the soft hum of the chandelier above them. 300 people sat in 300 different versions of the same fear. Some of them were afraid for themselves. Some of them were afraid for somebody they had come with. Some of them were afraid because they had heard, years ago, what this man did to people who lied to him in front of his own family. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The room had become one large held breath. Then a chair scraped at the back of the room. A man stood up. He was not young. He was a capo from a rival family. His name was Sal. He had thick shoulders and a thicker neck. He had eaten at this man's table before, years ago, when peace was new. He looked at the Don with eyes that tried to be brave and failed. Sal said it was him. Sal said he had been drinking. Sal said he had said something stupid to the bride in the hallway. Sal said he had grabbed her wrist for 1 second, only 1 second, and let go the moment she pulled away. Sal said he was sorry. Sal said he would accept whatever the Don decided. The Don did not answer. The Don did not even look at Sal. The Don kept his eyes on the rest of the room. He spoke again. He said one stood. He said he had counted 3 sets of footsteps in that hallway. He said 2 more men were in this room tonight. He said those 2 men had 10 seconds. Another chair scraped. This time it was on the right side of the room, close to the dance floor. The groom's own uncle stood up. He was an older man. Thin, white at the temples. Everyone called him Uncle Pino. Uncle Pino had given a speech an hour earlier about how love between families heals old wounds. People had clapped. Some people had cried. Now Uncle Pino was on his feet, and his hands were shaking so hard he had to grip the back of his chair just to stay upright. Uncle Pino tried to speak. His voice did not work the first time. He cleared his throat. He tried again. He said he had only meant to warn her. He said he had only meant to warn her about somebody else in this room. He said he had grabbed her by the shoulders because he was afraid for her. He said he had said something he should not have said. He said he had not touched her in the way the Don was thinking. He said it again, almost begging. Not the way you are thinking. The Don nodded once. Slowly. He still did not speak. He still did not move. He was waiting for the third. 7 seconds passed. 8. 9. On the very last second, a man at a small side table stood up. Nobody recognized him. He was not on either family's invitation list. He wore a dark suit that did not fit him quite right. He had a face you could pass on the street 10 times and never remember. He stood the way a man stands when he has already decided he is not walking out of the room he is in. Calm, almost relieved, like a man who had been waiting his whole life for this exact moment and was almost glad it had come. The Don looked at this third man for a long time. The hall stayed quiet. Outside the windows, the wind moved a tree branch against the glass. A waiter near the kitchen door slid 1 foot backward and then stopped, as if even moving an inch might be the wrong thing to do. The Don finally spoke. He said the first 2 could sit down. He said one of them had told something close to the truth, and one of them had told something almost true, and he would deal with both of them after the cake was cut. The capo Sal exhaled like a man who had just been pulled out of cold water. Uncle Pino did not sit. Uncle Pino kept holding the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him in the room. The bride still had not moved. The groom still had his hand on the small of her back. The bride's mother, who had been sitting at the head table, slowly stood up and walked the length of the room and took her daughter's free hand. She did not look at her husband. She looked at the third man. She had never seen him before in her life. But something in his face, something in the line of his jaw or the set of his eyes, made her go pale in a way the rest of the night had not. Then the Don turned his full attention to the third man. He asked his name. The third man gave a name. It was not a name anyone in the room had ever heard. The Don asked who had sent him. The third man did not answer. He just looked at the Don with that same calm face, that same almost relieved face. The Don asked one more question. He asked whose blood the third man was carrying. He used those exact words. Whose blood? That was when the third man finally smiled. It was a small smile. A tired smile. A smile that knew exactly how this night was going to end. He said one word. He said a single first name. It was the name of a man who had been buried 12 years ago. A man who had been buried by the Don himself. A man who had been the Don's own brother. The room did not gasp. It was past gasping. The room simply went still in a new way, a deeper way, the way a forest goes still when something larger than a wolf has just stepped between the trees. The bride finally moved. She turned her head toward her father. Her veil shifted on her shoulder. She said one word. She said, "Papa." The Don did not look at her. He could not look at her. Not yet. He was looking at the third man, and the third man was looking back, and 12 years of buried silence were sitting in the air between them like a thing nobody had named out loud until tonight. If you are still with me, if your heart is in this room with these people, hit that subscribe button now. Because what the Don does next does not just answer one question. It answers every question this family has refused to ask itself for over a decade. The Don stepped down from the small platform where the microphone stood. He walked past the bride. He walked past the groom. He walked past Uncle Pino, who still had not sat down. He walked all the way across the dance floor. Every step rang on the marble like a slow second hand. He stopped 1 arm's length from the third man. He asked the third man to say the name again. The third man said it again. It was the name of the Don's brother. Marco. The Don's brother Marco had been buried 12 years ago after what the family had always called an accident on a coast road. A car. A cliff. A closed casket. A funeral that the Don had paid for himself and stood through with his jaw locked and his hand on his sister-in-law's shoulder. The Don asked the third man how he carried Marco's blood. The third man said he was Marco's son. The Don said Marco never had a son. The third man said Marco had a son nobody was supposed to know about. A son born to a woman in a small town 2 hours north. A son raised under another name. A son who had grown up being told one story about how his father died, and a very different story about who had killed him. The Don listened. He did not interrupt. The third man said his mother had died 3 winters ago. He said before she died, she gave him a small wooden box. He said inside that box were 3 things. A photograph of Marco holding him as a baby. A wedding ring that had never been worn. And a letter. A letter Marco had written the week before he died. A letter Marco had hidden where only this woman would find it. A letter that named the man who was going to kill him. The third man said he had read the letter every night for 3 years. He said he had memorized every line. He said he had spent 2 of those years finding out who the people in the letter were, where they lived, what they did for a living, whose hand they shook on Sunday mornings. He said he had not come here tonight to hurt the bride. He said he had only wanted to look in her eyes for 1 second to see whether she carried the same look his father carried in the photograph. He said he had not expected to be touched by another man in that hallway. He said when Uncle Pino had grabbed her shoulders in the back corridor and whispered that she should tell no one about a man with Marco's eyes, he had been standing 2 doors away, and he had understood, finally, what his mother had never been brave enough to say out loud. The third man looked the Don directly in the eyes. He said the name in that letter was the Don's own name. The hall did not breathe. The bride lifted one hand to her throat. The groom put his hand on her back, very gently, the way you steady someone who is about to faint. Uncle Pino finally sat down because his legs had decided for him. The Don did not flinch. He had been waiting 12 years for somebody to say that name out loud in front of him. He had built a city of silence around that name. He had buried his own brother and walked away from the grave, knowing that one day somebody would come back across that road carrying it like a knife. He had spent 12 years putting people in place. 12 years writing letters that were never sent. 12 years answering questions from his wife about why he sat by a window every night for an hour without speaking. 12 years walking past a portrait of Marco in the hallway of his own house and not looking up. He had known a day like this would come. He had not known it would come at his daughter's wedding. He had not known it would come from a young man with his brother's eyes. The Don spoke. His voice was even quieter now. He said your father did die on that road. He said your father did die because of something he had done. But he said the man your mother named in that letter is not the man who put him on that road. He said your mother named the wrong brother. The room shifted. Heads turned just a few inches toward the right side of the hall. Toward Uncle Pino. Toward the older man who had stood up second. The older man who had given the speech about love between families. The older man who was not, in fact, the groom's blood uncle at all. The older man who had married into the family decades ago and quietly, slowly, climbed. The Don said Marco had been his younger brother. He said Marco had been about to break a deal with another family. He said Marco had come to him first, the night before he died, and told him everything. He said Marco had told him that the man pushing him to break that deal was not from the rival family at all. The man pushing him was sitting inside their own house, eating at their own table, calling himself uncle to children he was not related to. The Don said he had not killed Marco. He said he had spent 12 years quietly, patiently, taking apart the man who had. Piece by piece. Contract by contract. Friendship by friendship. He had let that man believe he was untouched. He had let that man stand at his daughter's wedding tonight and give a speech about love. Because tonight was supposed to be the night it ended. The Don said something else then. He said the letter the third man's mother had read was real. He said Marco had written it. But he said Marco had written it in fear, not in knowledge. He said Marco had named the wrong brother because Marco had been told, on his last night, that the brother who loved him most was the brother who was going to betray him. He said the man who had told Marco that lie was sitting in this room tonight, holding the back of a chair, with white hair at his temples and shaking hands. The Don turned finally and looked at Uncle Pino. Uncle Pino did not stand up again. He could not. The Don asked Pino one question. He asked Pino whether he had touched the bride tonight to warn her or to silence her. He asked Pino whether Pino had figured out that the third man was in the building. He asked Pino whether Pino had gone into that hallway to keep his own name out of a letter that had already been opened. Pino did not answer. The Don nodded, like a man whose last hope has just walked out a door. He said one word. He said okay. He turned back to the third man. He told him to sit. He told him no harm would come to him in this hall, on this night, in this family, ever again. He told him that the wedding cake would be cut. The orchestra would play. The bride would dance with her husband. And the matter of Marco would be settled tonight, but not in this room and not in front of this child in white. The third man sat. Slowly, like a man who had carried a weight for years and only now realized he was allowed to put it down. The Don walked back across the marble floor. He stopped in front of his daughter. For the first time all night, his face changed. Just a little. Just at the corners of his eyes. He took her hand in both of his. He kissed her forehead through the veil. He whispered something to her that nobody else heard. She closed her eyes. She nodded. A single tear ran down her cheek and disappeared into the lace of her dress. The Don stepped back. He turned to the orchestra. He gave the smallest nod. The conductor lifted his hands. The music began again. Not loud at first. Just a single violin. Then a second. Then the whole orchestra together, sliding back into the song they had been playing when the door slammed shut. The bride lifted her dress. The groom offered his hand. They began to dance. Slowly at first. Then a little faster. The guests, one by one, remembered how to breathe. Glasses were lifted again. The cake was cut. A child laughed somewhere near the back. The Don did not dance. The Don stood near the side door and watched. Sal sat with his head down at his table, untouched. The third man, the son of Marco, stood up once during the dance and walked slowly to the bride. He did not say anything. He just bowed to her, the way an old country bows to a young queen. She bowed back. He returned to his seat. Uncle Pino was no longer at his table. Nobody could remember exactly when he had left. Nobody asked. The groom's father, who was Pino's brother-in-law by marriage and nothing else, walked over to the Don during the dance and stood beside him without speaking. The two men watched the young couple turn together under the chandelier. After a long minute, the groom's father said one sentence. He said he had not known. The Don nodded. The Don said he knew. The two of them did not speak again. Outside the side entrance, the two men who had arrived with the Don opened the back door of the black car. Another man, an older man in a long coat, was helped into the back seat. He did not resist. He did not speak. He looked once at the lit windows of the hall behind him. Then the door closed. The car pulled away into the dark road. Inside, the wedding continued. It continued the way only certain weddings can continue. Not as if nothing had happened. As if everything had happened and been settled, and the people in the room had been allowed to keep their joy because somebody older had carried the hard part out the door for them. Kat danced with her father once, near the end of the night. The orchestra played a slow song. He held her the way he had held her when she was 4 years old and afraid of thunder. He did not speak. He did not have to. She rested her cheek against his shoulder and closed her eyes and let 12 years of unanswered questions finally, quietly, end. When the song was over, he kissed her forehead one more time. He thanked the groom. He nodded to the groom's father, who nodded back, and this time the nod was no longer stiff. The Don walked out of the hall the same way he had walked in. Slow, even, final. He did not look back. The chandelier kept humming. The cake kept being eaten. The children kept running between chairs. And somewhere on a dark road, a long-buried name was finally, after 12 years, being put back into the ground where it belonged. In the morning, the bride and groom would leave on a small plane to a coast neither of their families owned a single building on. The Don had chosen the place himself. He had wanted his daughter to start her marriage on land where nobody knew her last name. He had wanted her, for at least 2 weeks, to wake up to the sound of water instead of the sound of cars idling in a driveway. In the morning, the third man, the son of Marco, would meet the Don in a small kitchen at the back of the house. The two of them would sit across a wooden table. The Don would pour 2 cups of strong coffee. He would slide an old photograph across the table. A photograph of 2 boys, brothers, standing on a stone wall in a country that no longer looked the way it did in the picture. He would tell the young man stories he had not told anyone in 12 years. He would not ask for forgiveness. He would only ask for an afternoon. The young man would stay for 3 days. In the morning, Sal would be gone from the city. He would not return. He would write a letter by hand to the bride. He would apologize for the moment in the hallway. He would say he had been the smallest part of a very large mistake, and that he was grateful she would never have to see him again. The letter would arrive at the bride's new address. She would read it once, fold it carefully, and put it in a drawer she rarely opened. And Uncle Pino. Nobody in the family would speak his name again, not at weddings, not at funerals, not at the long Sunday tables where every other name eventually came up. His chair at those tables would be quietly removed. His portrait in the hallway would be turned to face the wall, and then, a year later, taken down. His silence would become the family's silence, which was, in the end, the only punishment that lasted. The Don lived another 11 years. He died in his own bed, on a quiet afternoon, with his daughter holding one hand and his grandson holding the other. He did not say much at the end. He only said one thing twice. He said, "Tell Marco. Tell Marco." Then he closed his eyes.